Okay, let's get started. Welcome. I'm Marina Onken, the Interim Dean of the College of Business and Economics here at UWRF. The Innovator in Residence is part of a series that is sponsored by the College of Business and Economics. We've had speakers from 3M, Target, Winfield, which is part of Land O'Lakes, and several local businesses. The speaker series is part of an overall innovation initiative within the CBE. We've had several courses developed in innovation, ranging from creative thinking, design thinking, to building business models. We also coach students for the Innovation Challenge, which is a campus competition in which students take their idea and build a business model using the business model canvas. Our students have won the Wisconsin Big Idea Tournament 3 times in the past 6 years. And our students also have had a social impact that is immeasurable. Hippie Feet, a social enterprise started 4 years ago, has pivoted during the pandemic and is releasing a new product line this weekend. They are experiencing the most revenue ever in the history of their company despite the pandemic. Dodomi, which won the Wisconsin Big Idea Tournament this summer during a virtual competition, is already sponsoring a school in Kenya to ensure that students have clean water. Our innovation program is for all students on campus, and you don't have to be a business student. In fact, the best groups are from all the areas of campus and all majors. Our students are changing the world, and it's an initiative that we have worked on for several years to teach students that they have an impact. It's why this year's Innovator in Residence is so compelling. Dr. Michael Thompson is the founder and CEO of KairosAg. He is personally passionate about eliminating poverty and hunger and professionally engaged in consulting in agriculture business development. I met him through my work at the St. Croix Valley Business Innovation Center, which is a local incubator that hosts startup businesses, and he was interested in using the St. Croix Valley Business Innovation Center as a place to start his business. During the presentation today, please add in your questions into the chat. We can have an ongoing conversation today about innovation, any kind of question about anything, whether it's business or about some of the things that he has experienced, where he has come from. Anything is really up for grabs today. So please welcome Mike Thompson, this year's Innovator in Residence.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you. It's a privilege and a delight to be here doing this today. I wish I could be doing it in person. I love engaging with audiences, but so be it. We'll move forward. Trying to advance the slide here. There we go. So I like to start talks. I start most of my talks this way. I've had the privilege of traveling around the world, been to 36 countries. And I've found people in every single country I've been to have some things in common, including these 3 things: integrity, passion, and insight. And I want to thank you, all of you, students and staff and faculty and whoever's on this presentation today, for your focusing on your integrity, passion, and insight, because it makes the world a better place. So thanks for participating today, and thanks for just thinking about those things in yourself. Okay, before I get into the content, a disclaimer. I know I'm speaking probably largely to business school students. My disclaimer is I have no formal business training. All the business stuff that I'm involved with has come from basically being scrappy and learning it on the job. I was trained as a scientist. I have a PhD in molecular biology, spent the first half of my career in the lab, and really got in the last 20 years out of my 35 or so year career so far, got into small and large companies and fell in love with the corporate aspect of applying science. So you just silenced my phone. I should have done that. Sorry about that. So I've been in large and small companies for quite a few years now. I've started 4 companies, 3 recently, and I've invested in a lot of companies. And what I'd like to do today is just share with you a few things I've learned along the way, focused towards primarily students and focused on innovation, entrepreneurship, and career path. And I really tie innovation and entrepreneurship together I think they basically go hand in hand. Here's the take-home message. My fundamental take-home message to you is, if you don't remember anything about what I say, I just hope you'll be inspired to take action on your own path. That would be the best outcome of the day for me. If you think about some of the things I say, the most important things in my mind that I've learned along the way are the importance of passion, the importance of perseverance, and the importance of creating value. I know those things just sound a bit like cliches right now. Hopefully, as I walk through this, I'm going to get into much deeper and specific examples of why those things are important. And I'll use my path as a way to get into that. Let me start by talking about innovation a little bit. I think a lot of people think there's an innovation formula. They want to know what this formula is. And I like this idea of, like, how do you pose the question to you? How do you make a small fortune as an entrepreneur? Or how I usually say it, how does one make a small fortune in biotech? I happen to be in the biotech field, okay? And think about that question. How would you make a small fortune as an entrepreneur? Because I have an answer that will guarantee success for you to make a small fortune as an entrepreneur. Are you ready for this answer? The answer is start with a large fortune, because you're guaranteed to lose money, at least for a while in the process. And really, the message here is, in my view, in all the years I've been at this, I say there is no formula. There is no formula. Don't fall for the idea that there's a formula, but there are principles. There absolutely are principles that can guide people to be more successful than not. And so what are those principles? These are just pulled from my experience, and other people you have do this may have a whole different set of principles. In my experience, these are some principles that I've seen have helped me have success, as well as the people around me have success. So, and I'm going to continue to focus on passion, but you see that's up there at the top. Having passion drives you and your ability to be productive and successful in a way that I couldn't have imagined before I got into a certain situation that I'm going to describe to you in some detail. No matter what you do, if you're not creating value, whether you're in a big company and you're in any position in a big company, in a small company, you're starting your own thing, you're in an academic setting, I don't care what setting you're in, where you're at, you've got to create value. The more you can stay focused on creating value, the more successful you're going to be. And I know that sounds like a cliche too, and hopefully I'll illustrate that in some detail later. Jump to the next curve. This one is hard to do. It's really hard to do. And I don't want to leave the impression that incremental value, creating incremental value, is not important. That can be very important. But if you can jump to the next curve, then you've launched yourself into an opportunity to, like, be massively successful at operationalizing something. I want to jump down to number 7. A great idea is just the beginning. It's related to the next one. I can't emphasize this enough either. A lot of people kind of go into this idea of innovation as the whole point is to generate great ideas. Yeah, that is definitely an important part of it. But the great idea is literally just the very beginning. 99% of the work comes after somebody generates a great idea. In all the companies I've been with, I guarantee you there's hundreds of great ideas sitting on the shelf because somebody didn't act on them or commercialize them or do the work that it takes to figure out how to get them into a market, how to apply them, and that sort of thing. And that takes me back up to number 4, where perseverance is, I think, as a behavior or a trait, probably the most important thing that you can have in terms of a behavior. Because the great idea is just the beginning, and it takes a heck of a lot of work after that. If you don't have this mindset of I'm going to persevere, then I just don't think you're not going to make it to the application stage. So number 5 here is one that I personally deal with. I've learned that about myself early on. I call it the all or nothing trap. I'm a bit too much of a perfectionist, and what that ends up doing to me is if I'm faced with a challenge and I can't get it perfect, in my mind anyway, then I tend to like not do it at all because I'm deathly afraid of putting a work product out there and somebody seeing it and thinking it's subpar. So I've had to learn to manage that behavior in myself, or I won't ever get anything done. And obviously, you're not going to be very successful if you're stifled from that kind of a thing. I know I am. I've seen a lot of people that deal with this, and I guess part of the message here is that's a behavior that you can manage, but you got to be aware of it. You got to admit it to yourself if you're that type of person, and then manage it. And by the way, there's a lot of behaviors that the more honest we are with ourselves, the more we'll recognize those behaviors that we have to manage along the way. A lot of people, I'm moving on to number 6 here, a lot of people, especially if you're trying to be very creative and entrepreneurial and so on, I found even around me and around the people that are like this that I know, there's a lot of people that'll just be the ones that say, oh, that'll never work. You can't do that. That's not possible, or whatever. I'm calling them bozos. And that's not an insult. That's just, there are people who simply don't understand what you're trying to do and they just don't think it can work or that it'll work, that'll be successful. There are other people who are the kind of people I have in my life, you probably have in yours, who know you, who you trust, and they may also say this won't work. I want to make sure, I convey the message that sometimes you do need to listen to people who say something won't work. But I'm also saying there's a lot of people who just say it won't work out of hand, and don't listen to those people, or you won't go for it. And I think you'll regret not going for it in many cases. So those are just off of my experience and from what I've learned and from what I've seen in people around me. So now I want to get into career path. And actually, let me go back up here because I'm going to go back to passion, okay? And I'm going to focus a lot on passion, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on every one of these, but I am on passion, creating value, and jumping the curve. So what I want to do to try to illustrate how important passion is I'm going to give you 2 versions of myself. And it's the same person. I'm not going to say different things about me, but I want the first version is going to be what I run into as a typical somebody describing themselves in an interview or just in almost any setting, and how people typically think about their career and their career path. And by the end of this, I think you're going to have obviously you're going to have a much better idea of who I am and kind of what I'm about. And I want you to think about when I go through this first way of going through my career path, which is a standard way to do it. It's not bad, it's not wrong. But then I'm going to do it again for you, and I'm going to do it in a way that reflects the importance of passion, and it's not made up. It's a true reflection of it, and I think you'll see that. So here's my career path. I grew up in Minnetonka, Minnesota. Went to the University of Colorado. I have a double major in chemistry and biology. Met my wife there. She's a mental health therapist. We've been married now for 36 years. And we decided to come back to Minnesota. She's from Boulder. Came back to Minnesota to go to graduate school. We didn't want to go at the same time. She went first, and I was a technician in a lab for a couple of years. And then I went back to graduate school, got my PhD in molecular biology at the U of M. Then I did a postdoc. I was a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Arizona in the biochemistry department. And then I had a chance to go to Monsanto. Now I've known about myself. I love the application of science. And so when this opportunity came up, I was very intrigued, and I went for it. I took advantage of it. I loved it at Monsanto. I was there for 7 or 8 years, and it was a great experience. Eventually, Lisa and I both wanted to make our way back to this area. My father was ill. I needed to be closer to my family. Some of you may know the company Biodiagnostics that's right here in town in River Falls. I knew the owner and founder of that company, and he needed somebody to run his DNA technologies area. So that was a good way for me to get back to this area. And I did that. I was the manager of his DNA technologies area for about 5 years. Then I got a call from a headhunter who told me about this Illumina position. Illumina is the world leader in manufacturing DNA sequencing and genetic testing equipment and the chemistry that goes with it. They knew there was great opportunity in genomics, but they didn't know anything in agriculture genomics, and they don't know anything about agriculture. So I was really in the right place at the right time, and I got the nod, and I decided to go for it. So I chose to leave biodiagnostics, and I started Illumina's agriculture business and ran that for about the same amount of time, 7, 8 years. And then I decided that was the best part of my career. I'm going to go into more detail on that, and you'll see why. But I wanted to do that again. So then I decided to leave Illumina, and I went to Benson Hill, and I was their vice president of partner development, which is really, I ran the commercial part of the organization when I went there. And then I knew I had this entrepreneurial spirit and drive, but most of my career, I also knew that I just didn't have the guts to be an entrepreneur. I felt much safer going to companies that were at least somewhat established and so on. Well, I was at Benson Hill for about 4 years on the executive team. Our strategy had evolved, and we got to the point where we were really implementing the last part of the strategy. And I knew I just wasn't needed as much as at that point as I was in the earlier days when I was there. So I thought this is the right time for me to leave Benson Hill and actually take that risk and try to see if I can start something on my own. And so I did that in March this year. I started KairosAg, and that's basically a consulting and business development entity. And under that, I've started 2 other companies. One is an indoor vertical farm here in River Falls, and the other one is more genomics, sort of mainstream genomics related software that is in the genomics world. And it originally will apply to agriculture, but it'll cross industries as well. That's the first version of my career path. You might have found it interesting. I'm really quite pleased with my career. I'm happy. I don't have any regrets. Now, I want to do one more thing. Before I go into the other way I want to tell you about myself, I'm going to do one more thing, and it's primarily aimed at the students, and it's based on some questions that I got prior to this. And I want to just point out some key things that I think, as I look back on my career, really helped my career. Okay, these weren't all planned out, but these are some key things that for me got me to go to the next step. The first one is on the left. You notice I put some years on the left because when I was an undergrad, and even when I was a graduate student and ending my graduate career or my graduate student training, I remember feeling like, man, the next thing that happens is going to determine the rest of my career. And it's got to be the right thing, and it's got to be big. And when I finished my PhD, I had one opportunity for a postdoc, okay? And that was to go to Arizona, and I did it. And it was a great experience, and I'll tell you how that happened. But so first of all, the feeling of the next thing that happens to me is going to determine the rest of my career. I want you to just figure out how to manage that out of your head, because it's just simply not true. And here's an illustration of it. You'll notice when I finished my postdoc at Arizona, that was in 1997. I subsequently went on to go to all these companies. And I just want to point out that 4 out of 5 of these didn't even exist when I finished my postdoc. Okay. So the next thing that happened to me absolutely didn't determine the rest of my career because 4 out of the 5 companies I went to didn't even exist when I finished my postdoc. So that's one message. The best way to set yourself up so you can be positioned to take advantage of things you want to take advantage of is to make sure you're passionate about what you're doing and you're good at it and you're productive at it, because you're going to be adding value, and that's the kind of person somebody's going to want to hire.
So there's a question, Mike,
Sure.
in the chat here from Grace. She's asking, did your career choices help you to learn the typical steps in product development?
Well, I guess you'd have to say yes, but it's not. I didn't make a career choice to learn that. That's not a bad idea, by the way. But in my case, so I'll just go through real quickly. When I was in Monsanto, I was on the research side of Monsanto. I was in the lab most of my years at Monsanto. My first job was to discover every gene in soybeans. So I was definitely in the technical side of it. When I got to biodiagnostics, I was really in a dual role. I was running the lab, and I was responsible for growing that business. So I was really beginning to think much more about what does a product look like that we can go out there and sell in order to grow the business. For sure, I learned a lot at that point. Where I really got into, though, much more in depth about product development was at Illumina. Much more mature company, even when I joined it, although it was in its early days. But they had much more defined product development, processes and strategy that fed into product development. How do you figure out what product to develop? How do you develop it? How does it relate to a market? How do you predict how much you can sell? All of that stuff. So I wouldn't say I made the choices to learn about product development, but I sort of was naturally put in places where I had a great opportunity to learn about product development, and I had to in the roles that I was in. I mean, I was the commercial lead for the ag business at Illumina. So hopefully that answered that question. Now, let me go back. I'm going to go quickly through this because I have a lot more to go through, but a few keys. So when I was an undergrad, and I think this will speak to many of your students, NIH over here stands for the National Institutes of Health. One of the most important things that happened to me at that stage is I got to participate in a program called the Normal Volunteer Program at the National Institutes of Health. That's a program where they go around to various universities and they recruit usually science students to come and live in their hospital and serve as normal controls for their biomedical experiments. So I got to do that. I was there for I lived in the hospital with patients for 3 months, and I was basically a guinea pig. And I could say no to any of these experiments. And I would love to tell you the experiments I went through, but maybe I'll save that for another time. The benefit, other than it being a fascinating experience, to me also is I got to work in a lab. And why that was so important is because I got to work in a lab at NIH, Prominent Research Institute, institution. And after the 3 months, my initial 3 months there, the person I worked for wanted me to come back as a regular employee. So I did that the next summer. And in those 6 months, I was in such a productive group. Two things happened that were super important. I got my name on 2 publications in the science field, and perhaps in your field. When you start getting into publications, that catapults you in ways that are just really valuable. The other thing is I learned how to do DNA sequencing. And at the time, this was in the early 1980s, that methodology was still chemistry based and it was just emerging. So to be able to do DNA sequencing was a hugely valuable skill. It got me a job back when I got back at the University of Colorado, got me a technician job in Minnesota before I went to graduate school, and so on. So that was one of the key things. Now, when I was in Colorado, I ended up working in a lab, again, because I could sequence, right next to Rick Halleck, the next name down here on the right. He was a professor at the University of Colorado. I put that on here because when I ended my PhD and I was looking for what I was going to do next, I ended up going to Rick Halleck's lab to do a postdoc. By then, he had moved to the University of Arizona. Never would have predicted when I first met him that I was going to do a postdoc in his lab, but he was doing intriguing things. He was pretty prominent in his field, and it was a great postdoc for me to do. And it's just one of those connections. I knew him from my undergrad days because I worked in a lab next to his, and I got to know all of his lab people and him. And by the time I went to do a postdoc, he knew me, he knew my PI at Colorado, and those things, I think, went a long ways to help me get a postdoc position in his lab. When I left there, I was there for about 4 years. The next step was to go to Monsanto, and this name on the right here is Tim Connor. Well, it turns out when I first came back to Minnesota and I was working as a technician, Tim Connor was a graduate student in the same lab I was working in. He and his wife became good friends with my wife and I, and turns out after he graduated with his PhD, he went to Monsanto. He was a leader there. By the time I was at that stage of looking for a job after a postdoc, he saw that I was looking for a job. He had some openings. He wanted me to come and apply at Monsanto. So I did, and I eventually got a job there. Another connection. One of the messages here is connections are super important. And I think it's important for you to understand you won't get a job just because you know somebody. You still got to be able to do the job. You got to be a good candidate for that job. But when you're those things and you know somebody involved, there's familiarity that enters into that equation. It goes a long ways in the hiring process. So when you're hiring, and I've hired a lot of people now, the more I can know about that person, the better. Fast forward here to Illumina, I got a call from a headhunter, and I was kind of leery about it, and I asked the headhunter who gave me his name, or who gave him my name, And he said it was a person's name, and it was a former colleague of mine from Monsanto. Then I decided, well, that person knows me pretty well, so maybe I should listen to this guy and see what this is about. That turned out to be really the best opportunity I've ever had in my career. Still the favorite part of my career were my Illumina years. So another connection from Monsanto to this ended up, I think, helping just get me connected to that opportunity. Nobody at Illumina knew me, but I was the right person. I was in the right place at the right time. I got lucky and I got the nod, so I got to start their ag business and run it for about 7 or 8 years. While I was there, I'm going to go into this in a minute, but one of the things I did is create something called the Greater Good Initiative, the Agricultural Greater Good Initiative. Todd Mockler, the next name on this list, is a researcher at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis. He's a top-notch guy. He's probably the most well-funded researcher they have. He was one of the recipients of my Greater Good Initiative. I was going to St. Louis at some point. He called me and we became friends by then. He said, hey, let's have dinner. Thought he wanted to talk about what Illumina and Benson Hill might do together. Turns out he brought the CEO of Benson Hill and another person, and we ended up having one of those conversations, like 4 or 5 hours, dinner, and it felt like 10 minutes. It was just absolute blast. We were all just connecting like crazy. And at the end, the CEO said, gosh, you really get what we're trying to do. Why don't you just come run this part of the business? And that started to really make me think, it's getting me closer and closer to that entrepreneurial thing I felt like I've always wanted to do. Benson Hill was an established company, but it was a startup much earlier than Illumina when I joined. And so I chose to leave Illumina and go for it to do it again. And those are some key factors, I think, that as I look back on my career, kind of really helped me follow this path. They weren't planned, but they helped me kind of move through this path. Okay. I'm going to stop that piece there. Go back to think about what you know about me right now. A lot more than when we started here. But now I want to give you a little bit different version of my past, and it's going to involve something that I learned at Illumina that absolutely crystallized how important passion is for me. Okay. This man is Matt Passard. He absolutely changed my life. When I joined Illumina, he was the VP of sales. He led the commercial team. At our first sales meeting, now bear in mind, I wasn't used to big company sales meetings. When I was at Monsanto, I never got to go to a sales meeting. I was on the research side. This company was about a $200 million company when I joined. It's probably $3.5 billion today. We grew the ag business from 0 to 150 million in about 7 or 8 years that I was there. And the first sales meeting I went to, we had our global sales meeting. All of the commercial people came together. It was in Las Vegas. There was carnivals, motivational speakers, Cirque du Soleil. I hope what you're thinking right now is this is sort of smacks of this big company culture of just bring people in. We'll just rah each other. We're gonna sell everything. We're all gonna be rich, because that's not an unusual situation, I think, in companies. Let me tell you what actually happened at this sales meeting. We're in an auditorium. We're getting ready to hear some so-called motivational speakers, right? Actually, I need to set the context just a little bit more. Illumina, as I said, manufactures genetic testing and DNA sequencing equipment and chemistry. We sold that stuff to researchers and companies all over the world, okay? And it was used for all kinds of different purposes, including looking for causes and cures for incurable genetic diseases in humans. And the same thing is true in animals, but it's much more impactful when you think about this kind of a story in humans. So now we're in our sales meeting. We're at this fancy, resort or whatever, a casino hotel. And Matt proceeds to bring in, I don't know, there were 4 or 5 speakers. These weren't motivational speakers like you're thinking. These were actually patients that came from hospitals that were using our equipment to try to understand the diseases that these people had. He brought these people in there so we could understand what they were going through and the impact that our equipment and chemistry and use of it was potentially going to have on their lives. I can't tell you how transformational that was. That was just an absolutely amazing time for me. Then everybody was organized and we were brought into another part of this hotel, and we were told there's going to be a carnival. So they, some people had set up this carnival, and we didn't go to a carnival. We staffed the stations at the carnival. And then once we got all oriented to these stations and what we were supposed to do, they brought in a bunch of kids. Excuse me. If you had been there, you'd understand. I mean, I get choked up when I talk about it, but they brought in a bunch of children, again, with rare and incurable diseases, and we helped them have fun at a carnival because they never get to do this sort of thing. So what Matt really accomplished there is he wasn't trying to be a rah guy. Come on, we can do this. You can sell 10 times more. He was trying to just help everybody understand how important what we were doing was, and showing us how important it was by the people that it impacted. Okay, that's how you build an inspired commercial team and an inspired sales force. And man, I tell you what, I walked out of there. So this is the first time I heard this question, and he posed it at one of our sessions at this sales meeting. And I just got so on fire with this question, and now I bring this up almost every talk I give. And this is the question, and I ask you to ask yourself this question. If you knew you could not fail, what world problem would you solve? And it's important to assume you won't fail. This is a theoretical question, but it's to get you to think about what's important to you. What is important to you in terms of big things that are bigger than you or me or any of us individually. And so I went home, and I immediately started talking about this with my family. This is my family. It's my wife and my two kids. My two kids were much younger at this point. And I think the first dinner we had together after I got home from that sales meeting, I brought up that question. And my kids rolled their eyes, but eventually we got into a really good conversation, and they really got into it, and they started thinking about what they would do. And they didn't want me to not answer the question. They wouldn't let us stop talking about it until I answered the question. And my answer was, I would eliminate poverty and hunger. I just felt passionate about that at that point, and I was beginning to put the pieces together, but I really hadn't put them together yet. And then the second question I asked my family was, what one thing could you do to contribute to a solution? Because none of us are going to solve these big problems by ourselves or overnight. So I answered that, and my answer was, I didn't have an answer, but I thought, gosh, I know all these agriculture people all over the world. I'm part of a company that has this transformational technology. Surely there's something I could do to aim this technology specifically at this problem of alleviating poverty and hunger. So then I go back to work, and honestly, because I began to really realize how important this problem was, and for my children to know and to reinforce that their ideas and all of our ideas are important enough for us to act on. So I wanted to act on mine for them as much as anything. So then I go back to work and I start talking about this, how sort of transformed I was by this sales meeting, and I was talking about with my family and blah, blah, blah. And this is Don Barry, who's now the president and co-founder of a company called Luna PBC. But we were colleagues at Illumina at the time I was there for all of my time there. And we became very close friends. And I remember being in some kind of management training course or something that you go through a lot when you're in these settings. And she and I were partnered up, and she said, I can totally imagine you going around the world giving talks about this sort of thing. And she just gave me enough encouragement to think, God, maybe you're right. Maybe there's some program or something we could create that would actually aim our technology. I mean, surely some people were already using it, but it wasn't like we were harnessing that as much as I thought we could be. So then, as I really started thinking about it, I show this slide because this is really the deep. This provides the deep meaning. Okay, this statistic might be slightly out of date, but it's probably not very far off. There's all kinds of statistics about hunger and poverty in the world. And when I came across this statistic, as I started to look through this, I thought, I don't need any other statistics to think to know that I need to be acting on this. Okay, a child dies every 6 seconds from a hunger-related issue. So I kept talking about it at work, and one thing led to another. Everybody was supportive. My management was supportive, right up to Jay Flatley, who was the CEO. I basically structured a program that we call the Agricultural Greater Good Initiative. And essentially what we did is we supported all of these projects. This was during my time there. And by the way, they've kept it going since I left. I'm really pleased to know. And so there's additional projects, but we supported one or two projects a year, and essentially donated technology to them, either in the form of equipment or reagents. And each of these were aimed specifically at some aspect of poverty and hunger. I'm in the agriculture world. These are all agriculture. And so these are typically aimed at trying to understand how we can create plants and animals to be more productive and to grow in places around the world where they don't grow very well today. And that gets to the very basic subsistence. My goal was the long-term solution to help cultures be more subsistent, self-subsistent, okay? This doesn't replace giving somebody who's starving food. Got to give people who are starving food today. But so I guess that's my story about, how innovation can lead to having a global impact. And talk about a global impact. None of this I ever imagined when I started, but that actually led to opportunities for me that I couldn't have imagined. The upper left here is this was me in the Ivory Coast, basically meeting with the ambassador to the US from the Ivory Coast. I got invited. The upper right-hand picture is a reception at the State Department. I didn't get a very good picture, but that's Hillary Clinton, and that's Rajiv Shah, the head of the USAID. And so I get to meet Hillary Clinton and presidents from different African countries. I've been to Africa a number of times now. I've gotten involved in other programs, and I've taken this concept to other companies like Benson Hill and gotten them involved and continued to sort of promote tools and technologies that we think can be aimed at alleviating poverty and hunger all over the world. So it's been fascinating and gratifying for me. And for you, that's an example of how something I did that started as a kernel of an idea, mostly to show my daughters that it's important to act on your ideas, and it led to this. Now, I know that everybody acting on their ideas doesn't necessarily lead to this, but I can guarantee you, if you don't act on your ideas, you definitely won't lead to anything like this. So act on your ideas, take a chance on doing that, okay? That is, for me, the most powerful example of why passion drove this whole thing, okay? And it allowed me to do it in the job I was in and connect what I was doing in that job to this passion. And it worked very well. But that's not the only impact. Now let's think about Illumina. There's a business impact here too. So this is David Walt. He's actually the scientific co-founder of Illumina. He, at the time, was a professor at Tufts University, and he was studying the olfactory, how we smell. How can our olfactory system be so sensitive and at the same time smell so many different things? And he was basically trying to create a way to replicate that in the lab. And he ended up replicating it with something called optical microwell arrays. And at some point they realized, wow, we can study the olfactory system, but this has far bigger implications than just a research tool for olfactory research. And it effectively was the technology that founded Illumina. Okay, well, that went on to become, like, I think I got this number on Monday, $46 billion market cap. It's a $3.5 billion company. That was the last full year of revenue reporting. Over 7,000 employees. They now have like over 10,000 instruments installed out there across the world. So again, if I go back to David Walt, he wasn't thinking about all that when he was thinking about doing his research, but that's another example of his innovative idea with all the work it took to create Illumina and then grow it and get it out in there into all these different markets, had that kind of business impact. And it can just be so amazing and gratifying, and it's a lot of fun. Now, this technology was also an example. This was not an incremental, this is the sequencing piece. This was not an incremental improvement on how we do DNA sequencing. Illumina went from microarrays to buying a sequencing company and then becoming the leader in DNA sequencing. It basically allowed us to go from determining the first human genome in 2001, estimated to cost about $100 million, took about 13 years. And depending on how you quantify all this, it was actually part of a project that was over $1 billion project when you think about the technology development pieces that were involved as well. but just the piece that was specifically aimed at the human genome was $100 million. It took the situation from that to, in 2016, we achieved $1,000 genome with Illumina's sequencing instruments. And now it's on track to do a $100 genome. And this is in a commercial setting. This isn't theoretical numbers. That is curve jumping, and that jumps curves both in the research world, where people don't even think about sequencing one genome anymore. They think about sequencing a population because it's so quick and cheap now. And so the things you can learn when you do that in the research world are much more powerful. And it's not just research, it's in the medical diagnostics world as well. This leads to all kinds of medical diagnostic opportunities and the things we've learned about those rare and incurable diseases that I talked about earlier. It's just like coming out of the woodwork. We can understand the genetic causes now of many of those things that weren't understood before. So again, it's not just sort of the human impact story, but it's, I mean, the successful business here is just an amazing story as well. So I'm going to end there because I do want to leave time for questions. But sometimes people wonder like what books other people are reading. Along the way, these are some books that I found to be really fun, really informative, and really interesting and helpful. If you haven't ever heard of this person on the upper left, Guy Kawasaki, he was at Apple in the early days of Apple and was one of the people responsible for making Apple what it is. He didn't discover the computers, but he was more on the building the business side and the marketing side. When it comes to, you know, I keep focusing on finding your passion. Ask yourself that question that I posed earlier. That's a good start, but a much more thorough way to approach this is go listen to things. And I would be surprised if you haven't already heard of this guy, Simon Sinek, but he's got a couple of books here. Find Your Way, or Find Your Why, and Start with Why. He's all about passion driving people's success. So I highly recommend that if you're kind of thinking about, well, okay, I believe you about passion, but I don't know what to do, you know, go find those books and start to dive into those. And then not about passion so much, but just about a really interesting business concepts. This Platform Revolution book, I was fascinated by. I just couldn't get enough of that book. And it just talks about creating these platforms that revolutionize business models. And I'll leave it at that. And then a friend of mine, Paul Goudreau, wrote this book on the lower right-hand side called Own Your Career. No one else will. Again, I think it's a really important message. You are in charge of your career. You may have people around you that want to help you and so on, but ultimately you got to take control of your own career. And he's put a little book together that I think is really fun and fast read and just tips that he kind of gleaned from his career as well. So, all right, I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for your attention, and we can open it up to questions if you'd like at this point.
So one of the books that was recommended to me this week, I got this from one of our alum who works at 3M. And he's part of a book club there, and he is reading Play Bigger right now. Yeah,
Play Bigger is, I have that one as well. I love that. Good to Great, I think, might be the same author.
Okay.
Great is another one that's along those lines of Play Bigger. Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah, there's a million good books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions that ended up in actually in the Q&A, if we have an idea, so it's a student, if we have an idea for an innovation, but do not have the skills ourselves that are necessary to create it, how would you recommend finding someone that could help us make it a reality?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and I think it recognizes an insight that's pretty important. And that insight is, one of the reasons there's hundreds of great ideas on shelves is because the people who come up with the great ideas don't necessarily have the skills to pitch that idea and convince other people to give them money and then do all the other things after that. So it recognizes that insight, and I think that's important. How do you go about finding those people? I mean, I don't think I have a magic bullet here or a silver bullet and magic answer, but it's just sort of common sense, basic. Start with the people around you and see if you can figure out if somebody is willing to listen to your idea, who maybe is in a setting that you think can get you connected to somebody else, or if they already are maybe the right person to start really structuring a way forward to convert your idea into an application in a business. But for sure, if you're a student right now and you're in a business school, you've got all kinds of resources right there at the university to go talk to, and that's critically important. Is you can't be afraid to just go talk to people. Like you might think somebody else will think your idea is really dumb, but you've got to not let that control you. If you think you have a great idea and you're excited about it, go tell somebody. Go talk to Dr. Onken. She can connect you with me. I'd love to talk to people about their great ideas and think about if they're worth trying to apply. And if you do, how do you do it? How do you get venture capital, or do you need venture capital? All these things. But it's got to be a process of, sort of one step at a time, working your way out to the circle of influencers that can actually get you what you need. Well, and one of the first steps might be finding somebody who also gets excited about your idea, who knows how to pitch it to somebody who has money. That's a really critical thing.
So one of the things that I advise our students here, so let's say they have an idea, but maybe it's based upon chemistry. Well, there are chemistry majors on campus, or go ask a chemistry professor or the chair of the chemistry department to walk through it and then suggest here's a good student who might be able to work with you on that project. So we've had great success doing it that way too. It's a university. There are really smart people everywhere you look on campus.
Absolutely. And those professors are probably all connected to other professors and in other places and other people with different expertise. I totally agree. That's really a great place to start. With a caveat, you go talk to a chemistry professor, and I happen to know one who's I think is very good right here. And I'm not saying he would do this, but go talk to a chemistry professor about a chemistry idea you have. And by nature, chemistry professors may be skeptical. And they need to be skeptical for certain reasons. But so I'm just cautioning you that what you want from that chemistry professor is, if your idea is legitimately bad, like the chemistry isn't actually legitimate, you want to know that as soon as possible. And that's something a chemistry professor probably could help you understand. But if the chemistry professor say, yeah, you're right about the chemistry, but there's no way. Do you realize what it would take to do that? Who's going to do that? All these sort of naysaying kind of feel. And that's just coming from, I think, the natural sort of resistance that I think science professors in general, and I know a lot of them, will have in those kind of situations. So don't let that stop you, basically.
Well, and learning that resilience in the innovation process as well, understanding that that the chemistry or the science of it works, but if somebody tells you that the idea won't work, you really don't know that until you've tested it with potential customers.
Yeah, and furthermore, if somebody says the idea won't work, then maybe you need to go find the right person who understands how you could potentially make that idea work. Not somebody who's never just created a business out of something.
So here's a question from a student. How do you deal with bozos if you fail?
Well, you do have to be open to failing, because you probably all know the statistics better than I do. I mean, most startups fail. How do you deal with bozos when you mean, I guess the spirit of that question is, like, isn't it embarrassing to go back to that person who said that'll never work when it didn't work? I don't know how you deal with them. I mean, it depends on who they are and what your relationship is, I guess. But so maybe sometimes you go back and say, yeah, you were right. We tried, but man, here are the hurdles we couldn't get over. And if you're good friends, it'll just be like, it'll be fine. But if they're just going to hold it over your head for some reason and you don't want that, then I don't know. I wouldn't bring it up.
No kidding. You don't bring it up, but also we have to learn from our failures. And that's something the lean startup methodology too, that we learn to fail earlier, because if we can fail earlier, we learn more and we can iterate then to the next step.
Yes.
Whatever that happens to be. Just pick up another idea or push that idea in a different way and pivot it.
And you remind me of another really good book called Mindset. And it talks about a growth mindset, which is exactly what you just said. It's you don't, when you confront something that feels like you can't, you don't know it or you can't get past it, that's not a failure. That's an opportunity to figure out how to learn something.
Yep.
And that book goes through a lot of examples of people that you wouldn't expect really had to do that. Like Michael Jordan is a kind of a famous one, but that guy he didn't even make the varsity team, his varsity basketball team in high school. So it's all about working at things and learning and getting better. Yeah.
Exactly. How do you protect your innovation from others taking it and developing it? Do you have any tips on how students should get money to develop their innovation? So that's actually two questions. One of them is protecting your innovation, and the other, how do you get money to develop your innovation?
Yeah. So how do you protect it? Really, I mean, that really depends a lot on the innovation itself. If it's the sort of thing that's patentable, obviously that's the common path, is you want to patent it. If it's not patentable, like if it's software, I mean, you go talk to a computer science person who will tell you how do you code something in a way that somebody else can't just get into the code and manipulate it. And you want to be careful about who you share it with in some ways. On the other hand, if you decide you're going to try to create a business, you're probably disadvantaging yourself if you think, well, if you're trying to get money in particular and you think, well, I can't tell you all the details. You know what? You're in a position where just share all the details. Your biggest problem right now is you can't get money. And you're definitely not going to get money if you don't share enough details to help somebody be confident that what you have is real. So there is a time where you want to really, that balance has to tip, and you don't be afraid of somebody stealing it. What are you going to do anyway if you can't, do anything with it? So how do you get money is it's a second question, definitely a different question. And, that's kind of also depends on your sphere of influence, who you know, but there's different ways and different sort of levels of getting money. It can start anything from, it depends on how much money you need, but let's say you're developing software. Maybe you find somebody who's willing to put in some money and you put in a little bit of money, and you don't need a lot because you can just live very frugally and so on. And you just put a little bit of money in the pot to feed yourself for 6 months or whatever you might need. It can be to that, to putting a lot more money in the pot. Maybe it's family, maybe it's friends. And there's a saying in this area where it's the 3 F's, right? Family, friends, and fools. Generally, it's not advisable to go to your family and friends if you can help it. But if you have to, that's sometimes is potentially a place to get money. But really, where it starts to get probably more real, unless you come from a family with a lot of means, is to try to connect to. There's 2 different sort of levels of investors. There's angel investors, and then there's venture capitalists. So, angel investors are usually people who have a fair amount of wealth, and they're really wanting to put that money into something that they're passionate about and help it grow and see it grow and even participate to some extent. Venture capitalists, I'm going to overstate this, but only a little bit. Venture capitalists aren't even interested in, they'll hear you for 10 minutes. And if they're not convinced that you can give them a 10-fold return in 5 years, you're done. Okay. They're all about the money and the return.
Yeah.
Which is fine. But when you get to the point of pitching to a venture capitalist, or actually any of these things, go read that book. One of the books I cited there is called The Reality Check, Guy Kawasaki. He walks you through, and he's done this a lot more than I have. He walks through a lot of these scenarios and details, and very informative on this question. I would highly recommend that book for that person who's really thinking about this.
I just want to point out too, for the students and also faculty and staff on campus, that we do have voices on campus that can help you protect your intellectual property. We've had several students who have filed for patents, for instance, through voices. And depending if you want to follow through and actually get the patent and so forth, you can work with WISIS. You can also do it privately, but WISIS will also help you market the patent as well. And so there is that availability to you as well as you move forward with your innovation. So there are ways to be able to protect it. We do have that on campus, and actually filing for a patent can be done even on your own very inexpensively. So it's not a huge investment upfront to be able to do that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is a great resource, and they actually, believe it or not, WRF, which is kind of related in some ways to WISE. WRF is the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. Mm-hmm. That is like a $3 billion foundation, mm-hmm. because there's a drug called warfarin. If you're familiar with it, it's a blood thinner. Oh. And that drug made a lot of money, and it came from a discovery at the University of Wisconsin. Huh. But that put a lot of money into this foundation. So they actually have a program called the Accelerator Program, and they hire consultants for some projects to get basically help get advice or creative thoughts or whatever, just additional input to some of these projects, to how they can get them to market faster. If they're worth commercializing, how can you accelerate their commercialization path and so on. So mm-hmm. you get connected to that, and you're going to immediately be connected to potentially a network of really good people.
Mm-hmm. So here's another intellectual property protection question. If your innovation is based off of another innovation, do you have to get permission to change or improve the innovation? And is there anything especially you have to do to avoid legal issues?
My answer is, I would assume you will have to get a license to the other innovation, but of course it's going to depend on how well that patent was written. I'm assuming it was patented. How, if they've ever come after anybody, mm-hmm. if it, it depends on the context. But mm-hmm. I think the safest thing to do is assume you got to get a license to, if you really used another innovation to create yours and you want to commercialize it, you absolutely need to figure out if you need a license from that other one. You probably will.
Yeah, you probably will.
Yeah.
So it's best to consult then with a patent lawyer.
Yeah.
And we have a few in the area as well.
Yep, exactly.
Mm-hmm. So another question is actually from a faculty member who wants you to talk a little bit more about what you're doing now at Kairos, and is familiar with biodiagnostics and Illumina, but didn't know much about Kairos.
Yeah, you won't find anything about Kairos yet. I use the name Kairos because it's Greek for the opportune time to act on something. And I just felt like that's what was driving me to leave Benson Hill and start to try to do something on my own. And I also think it's the absolute right time to get into indoor farming, vertical farming. So when I left Benson Hill, I decided I'm at a point in my career where I could just retire, but I still had some fire in my belly, and I wanted to do something, and I wanted to act on this entrepreneurial thing. So I started Kairos, as I said earlier, really as a way. I didn't want to sell myself as a consultant and just try to do that, but people were already approaching me very early on to do some consulting work. So I started it as a sort of a business to do consulting work and business development work. In fact, I'm a consultant to WRF on that accelerator program. I've gotten more consulting work that's come my way than I imagined I would. And I'm privileged to be able to just take stuff that I think is important and work with people I want to work with and so on. So that, for Kairos Agriculture, that's really what that was set up for. But then part of the business development activity has been to start these other two businesses. So the other one is called Kairos Indoor Ag. I just love the name, and I think it applies to indoor ag, the opportune time for that as well. So I kept the name, and I just used indoor ag. That's brand new. That actually was just formalized and filed with the state last week. I'm going to be installing the equipment next week. They're coming up on Tuesday. So we're setting up basically an indoor farm to grow lettuce and herbs primarily. And we'll probably, when I started talking about this business, it was 2 years ago. I actually met with Dean Van Galen, the chancellor at the time. He was excited about it. I wanted to make sure I was connected to the university for 2 reasons. One is potentially to sell lettuce to your food service program, but more fun, that's an important business reason. But the more fun reason is because I wanted to see if we could create an opportunity to help the university bring in grant money. So I could work with the university for them to get grant money to study, to do breeding, for example. How can you breed things to be more productive in an indoor growth setting, or to be more nutritious or flavorful and that kind of stuff. So I met with the dean of college and of food and ag. He was excited. There was a plant breeder who was a professor there. So those are things I'm going to be revisiting now, because that was a couple of years ago. But now that we're actually getting this thing established, I'll be revisiting that. And so that's what that company is all about. And I'd be happy to, if people want to reach out to me at some point when we get it set up, we can take them over there and show it. It's not anything fancy really, but it's kind of cool, these machines. You can look them up there's a company called Fork Farms, and they're partnering with me on this. But you can get a lot of information about these things called the Flex Farms that I'll be using. So the other company is, as I said, it was really, the origin of the idea came when I was at Illumina. I thought I need to be able to connect, potential users of genomic services to the services better. And I just thought, like, why can't we create an app that's like an Uber app for genomic testing? When you use Uber, if you've used Uber, you need a car, you need a ride somewhere. You call up the Uber app, tell you where you want to go, and it says, oh, you have 3 or 4 cars in your vicinity. This one is here, this one is there, and so on. Well, we could create, what we're doing now is we're creating an app like that for genomic testing. You want to sequence 20 genomes or whatever it is, you punch it in, and it'll tell you here's a set of labs, pricing, quality, and various metrics that you're going to want to know if you're going to do genomics, or if you want to have a lab do that for you. So, and then it's evolved a little bit, and I find this fascinating, but it's evolved to be even more foundational than that, where we think we can actually use this more as a platform, back to the platform revolution concept, to actually allow people to access massive amounts of compute power through a distributed computing network. The app will do that for us. And so we have to have users and sharers. And so that's more foundational. So there are fields like image analysis is an example. It's really important in agriculture now. It's really important in medicine. It's being used in all kinds of places, but it takes a lot of compute power to analyze these images. And people are trying to create software that automates the analysis of images for various purposes. Maybe it's detecting a disease in a tissue, or maybe it's detecting the yield of a crop in a farm field. And there's all kinds of analysis that goes along with the images that get taken for those purposes. This could be a way you could get a lot of compute power without having to buy a bunch of servers in the cloud. So that's kind of the base part of the other business. That one is also official, and the programming has started. I'm partnering there with a person in Florida and a couple of people in Germany. The programming is actually happening in Germany.
So there's one last question from a student who says, I love the name meaning behind Kairos, but what were the challenges that you faced forming Kairos?
Well, forming the KairosAg, the first thing I talked about, just the consulting piece, that was super easy. There's really no challenges. Any one of us can go check to, come up with a name, check to make sure it's legally usable, and then go file a LLC with the state if you want. Costs you $130, I think. There's no issues there. That's easy. But that's an easy one. That's not a good example because it's just easy, because it's for consulting mainly. Where I started to run into challenges was like with the indoor ag business. And I think Sherry Marnell might be on here. She can talk to you about some of these challenges. But then you start to, when that's a business that's going to actually produce a product and sell it to a consumer. Okay, and even more complicated, it's a food product, although it's not under certain food regulatory measures, but it's going to be something people eat. So forming a business like that is very different, because now you're talking about, do I have the right technology to actually produce the thing I want to produce? I'm pretty familiar with a lot of these technologies that grow things indoors, and I got really familiar with Fork Farms. The CEO and one of his investors have stayed at my house now. I want to get to know these people, and I wanted them to have skin in the game. So that was the first challenge: is what technology should I use? Then where do I do this? I can't do it in my, I mean, I could do it in my garage, but then I would violate zoning, laws. So I got to find the right space to do it. And then you go start looking for space, and all kinds of things can pop up in terms of, whether it's the right space or not for a particular business. Okay. And I did run into some of those things. Eventually I found some space that's going to work really well for me. But you might run into space issues where you got to put in a lot of money to potentially make it, put in some upgrades to do what you want, or it doesn't look quite right if you're going to bring potential customers in there, or dealing with the people involved. That's always something you want to pay attention to. And then, so now let's say you found space, and then you realize, well, geez, I need insurance, and I don't know anything about insurance. So now I got to learn about insurance, or I get somebody to help me. So I go to my local insurance guy who I know from our Rotary International group, and I've been in that for some years. And so general liability insurance, workers' comp insurance, and it's like, I just had this great idea. I didn't think I was going to have to wade into all these other issues. Those are the kinds of issues that start to create challenges. And those are the kinds of issues that start to cause people to not have enough perseverance to get through them sometimes as well. But you end up getting into all these other issues. Taxes. So here's a good one. We put, partners put money in the pot. That money is supposed to give us a 3-month runway to start this business and hopefully get it to cash flow itself. And oops, I just ordered $60,000 of equipment, and I didn't put enough money in there to pay the taxes on that. So I just reduced my, my startup pot by $3,000. Those are the kinds of things you run into when you're, unless you're doing this enough and you've run into these things before, then you can think about them. But you got to think through these things, and I haven't started a business like this before, so that's partly the fun of it for me, to be scrappy and see if I can pull it all together. And I have enough experience to deal with many of these things that I think it's going to work. But there's a lot of details I've run into that I didn't know anything about, and you just gotta have that growth mindset and learn about it and figure out the best path forward. So,
well, thank you very much. This was incredibly informative and inspiring, and I'm hoping that this will inspire students to also think about how they can change the world. We just do it one little corner at a time. We can have an impact. It's always a learning process. That's what life is all about. If students are interested in talking further about innovations, about ideas that you might have, please contact me. I'm the interim dean of the College of Business and Economics. We also have an idea-thon that's coming up, which you get to hear about how to go through the Lean Startup methodology for the Innovation Challenge, but it's just a really great opportunity just to talk about innovation. We also have a makerspace now in the College of Business and Economics. It's interesting that we finally have it up and running. It's a physical space, but now in COVID, virtually it's all virtual. However, if you do have some interest in working in a makerspace and make stuff during COVID, let us know. If you attend to the Ideathon, we'll definitely let you into the makerspace and create an approximation of what your business idea would look like. We call it a minimum viable product. So I just want to put that out there for the students as well. Thank you very much for attending today. Really appreciate it. And let's get together and innovate.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
All right, take care.